Do you want to, why don't we get started? Someone have to take control. Thank you, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here. And I have to say, it's wonderful to see such friendly, happy faces. I never envisioned myself on this side of the aisle. And it makes it, what? I'm sorry? Turn it up?
With all the hugging and everything.
Yeah, okay.
Okay.
Is that okay?
I'm gonna turn it up.
All right. Is that better? Okay, how's that? Okay. Well, thank you for being such a friendly crowd. It took my nerves down a couple notches. When I heard that there were going to be 54 at a luncheon that I thought might be 12 to 14, I'm like, okay. Anyway, thank you to Jane, Jenny, Diane for helping with lunch. Huge success, and all I can say is the proof of the pudding is in the eating. And today's message is just that. There is hope for gluten-free. It doesn't have to be tasteless or have a texture like cardboard. And so I'm happy to share my story, my personal journey, and at the same time give you a primer on what it means to be gluten intolerant. Not just the categories and the statistics, but we'll dive in a little bit into exactly what gluten is and where it can be found. And you'll realize that it's found in some very unsuspecting places. But before we begin, I thought it would be fun to play the Today Show segment that tells the story behind the cookbook. My co-author, Joe Hoppy, and I were lucky enough to attract the attention of the Today Show about 3 months after the book came out. And oddly enough, it was the story of 2 women in their second act. Now, we fit the bill, and we both happen to be 100% Italian-American and gluten intolerant. So it was a match made in heaven, and it was a fun segment. So bear with me for a second.
Matters. It's about getting caught up and getting ahead, because every day deserves the best start.
They were 2 Italian women who were told never to eat pasta again.
It was like being given a life sentence.
No, it was a fate worse than death, actually.
Cynthia D'Elia Coddington and Joe Provenzano Hoppy were both diagnosed as gluten intolerant 12 years ago.
When you're Italian, you basically do nothing but think about what you're going to eat.
Cynthia met Joe for the first time in 2019 at a neighborhood dinner that Joe made gluten-free, and Cynthia says it was delicious.
I really was shocked. From there, we became instant friends because this is a huge thing to have in common. But I should also say that we're both 100% Italian-American. We're both the oldest children in our families. And the list just went on and on and on.
Both women had recently retired from decades-long careers in Massachusetts, Cynthia in finance and Joe in technology. They were also neighbors owning homes in Maine, 2 lots apart.
We really wanted to pursue other interests that we never had the time to do.
In 2021, they took an online cookbook class during lockdown.
And we started this project by, asking our family, what recipes do you think would be great for us to include? We also had favorites of our own that we've adopted. 4 tablespoons of extra virgin olive oil. The mission was to help others who were on the same journey with gluten intolerance.
About 1% of the population with the autoimmune disorder celiac disease must be gluten-free, but it's estimated that 10% or more also choose a gluten-free diet, helping support a growing multi-billion-dollar industry.
It is a special project, so we never really envisioned that we were going to be published authors.
The challenge, Cynthia and Joe say, was to reimagine their family's recipes without gluten, but with as much or more taste.
I have a biscotti recipe in the book, and it took many trials. And Joe and I went back and forth and tested each other's recipes.
Both women had big shoes to fill, from Italian mothers and grandmothers who made every meal an event.
Every Sunday at 2 o'clock, it was the tomato sauce, as the Italian Americans called gravy. And then the pasta to accompany it would be sometimes ravioli, sometimes spaghetti.
So we were always 9 people at the dinner table every night. At 6 o'clock, you had to be in your sleep and ready to eat.
And it was important to have healthy meals, tasty meals, prepared most of the time from scratch.
Their cookbook, Senza Glutine, was self-published this year, but the two say it was a labor of love.
It's like the very end of Casablanca when Rick turns and says, Louis, I think this is going to be the beginning of a great friendship. And that's exactly what happened in our case.
It's nice.
So Joe and Cynthia say they're just thrilled with the many gluten-free products that are available in grocery stores now, especially a lot of the pastas you can get imported right from Italy if you order from there.
And how's the taste?
The taste is great because what they do is they did all the research for you. So say you're baking products, they say, well, use this flour alternative for that. Use this for that. You know, and they did all that research for you, and they're very specific about it, how to stock your pantry gluten-free. It's just
But
really
it is
helpful.
so much easier because Nick was gluten-free when he was 5 years old. You were ordering a lot online. Now you go into every major grocery
it's a new
chain.
business.
They're all there.
That's good.
Good story.
Jesus, look at the time. It is already back to school, and teachers and students need your help to supply their classrooms.
Everyone hear me okay? Okay. That little 3-minute segment took 5 hours of work. And the only thing that kept our nerves intact was that it took place in my kitchen, and it was a recorded Zoom. Because it happened in, when was that, 2023? We were kind of on the tail end of COVID, and the Today Show producer didn't want to send in a videographer. So I remember this so well. She said, you know, we're just going to do a Zoom interview and have one of your husbands video you. And Joe and I said, absolutely not. So we managed to find a videographer locally who did a wonderful job. Of course, we fed him. And that's the result. And that really propelled us. We sold over 1,500 books after that segment was aired in March of 2023. I call this book my COVID Pearl because COVID provided the time to do projects that you never had time to focus on. And putting together a family cookbook was one of them. Who had time to do that? In both of our cases, we were working full-time, raising kids. It was a dream. And so now that we were trapped in our living room, it was just perfect. We had the time to do it. And the cookbook course that came across my desk provided the perfect framework. We had 6 weeks, 3 hours each week that took us through one facet of putting together a family cookbook. So with that, we began. At the end, we decided to do it together because we were both from southern Italy. We were both gluten intolerant. Joe is celiac, I'm gluten sensitive, and so we began. We self-published, which is another whole story in and of itself, but not having any experience with publishing a book, we took the do-it-yourself approach, and fortunately today, with the help of technology, that's possible. If I were to do this again, I might do it a little differently, but it was a learning experience. So the message we want to send is there is hope. If you use quality ingredients and you use reliable recipes, you can arrive at a great result without having to spend hours in your kitchen. What happened with that, Chris? Am I not in slideshow mode?
Where's that little clicker thing?
How's that? Okay, we're back. We're back. As was mentioned in the Today clip, I'm the oldest of 4 kids, and I'm also the oldest grandchild of 12. So in and of itself, there's a lot of people. And because I was the oldest, it meant that I was recruited to be in the kitchen with my mother, who's in the middle, and my 2 grandmothers. And I helped, but even more than that, I absorbed. I absorbed a lot of information, techniques, family stories from these 3 who are intuitive cooks. And what I mean by that is few recipes were ever used. It was a pinch of this, a pinch of that, and quantities for a small country. So we had to take on the task of gathering these family recipes. So we did that. That was our first step. We asked siblings, we asked extended family. In my case, my mom is still alive. She's 89, and I was able to tap her knowledge as well. Joe did the same. So we gathered these family recipes, and then we set to work to make them doable and accessible to people who weren't intuitive cooks. And writing these things and having them be precise required a lot of trial and error. So we did that. The other thing we did was curate. Now, both of us being working moms, we didn't have hours of time to spend. And so we also had curated or collected favorites from various sources, our cookbooks, online, and then we adapted them to our family's tastes, as well as now taking that another step to adapting it to gluten-free. So we included those as well. The other thing we did was create. Now that we had some experience behind us, we knew some of the techniques, we knew some of the ingredients, we stuck our toe in the water and started creating. We have a couple of recipes in the book. One that comes to mind is replicating a couscous. As you may know, couscous is wheat. You can't have couscous. So Joe set out to really replicate this and used a whole grain sorghum, which is a naturally gluten-free grain, and she achieved a great result. We will be doing more and more of that now that the book is out, and we're still cooking a lot in our kitchens. I mentioned that we deglutenized the family recipes. That was essential. But even more important was to identify the best-in-class gluten-free ingredients. Now, that may sound simple, but there isn't a whole lot in our grocery stores. And so what we did was we looked online, we went to specialty shops, and we did a ton of taste testing. It's quite amazing that we're not 300 pounds after this little effort. Those were the influencers at home, my mother and 2 grandmothers. These are my influencers abroad. This picture was taken about 2 years ago, almost to the day, when we spent a month in Italy. And these are my cousins, my mother's first cousins. They're in southern Italy near the city of Bari. And after we arrived, Mitch and I arrived, one of the first things my cousin did was bring me downstairs to show me all the tomato sauce she had made. Now, mind you, there was a little bit of a language barrier. I'm proficient at Italian, but not fluent, and she speaks no English. But we spoke food. And here she is showing me this bottle of tomato puree, and I think she must have had about 50 of them in her pantry. But what really struck me was the size of the pot. And so I had to have a picture of that. On the left-hand side is her sister, Mima, who's making something that's native to that area called panzerotti. And what that is it's a small turnover that's deep fried and stuffed with either tomato sauce and cheese or any kind of sautéed vegetable. They knew that this was a favorite of mine when I had visited many years prior, so that was pulled out. And we videoed them making these things so I could document it and remember it. What's unique about this dough is that there is a boiled potato in it, which is a different dough than you will find from the north of Italy. As you may know, there are 20 regions in Italy, and they all have slightly different cuisines. Even the 2 regions that my family's from in southern Italy, the Adriatic, Puglia, to Campania on the Mediterranean. There's some commonalities, but there's also stuff that is very unique to each one. Here's a few more pictures that we incorporated in the book, and I mentioned that upon our arrival. Basically, the reinforcements are called in, and I have cousins here in the lower left-hand corner. Mitch is at the table there. And it's a big thing to have a meal together. It's a way to connect. It's a way to welcome. Basically, it's a way to love. So why did we do this? Well, we didn't originally set out to publish. We originally set out to put together a family culinary album. But we got to a point where we had collected over 100 recipes. It surprised even us. And we thought, well, we remember how we felt when we received this diagnosis of gluten intolerance. This surely could help others. So that's when we began to seriously consider publishing this. And the purpose of that was to educate, to provide a jump start or a roadmap, basically to speed up the learning curve, and to empower people who are following this lifestyle. I hate to say the word diet because I think diet really has the connotation of deprivation. It's not that at all. We want to spread the word that there is hope and it's entirely achievable. My personal diagnosis started 14 years ago when I was diagnosed with a thyroid autoimmune called Hashimoto's. Very, very common. But I was told by my doctor, you really have to eliminate all gluten. And I really remember that day so vividly because I looked at him and I said, no, you don't get it. We eat bread, we eat pasta, and I just was completely overwhelmed. I didn't know where the first step was. Keeping in mind, too, that I was self-employed and I was running my own financial planning practice. We had 2 kids at home, teenagers, otherwise known as eating machines. And I was trying to have a family dinner most nights. And now I had the added complication of accommodating my restriction. So at first, I just eliminated pasta. And then I introduced it back because pasta is a quick meal. You can make that in 30 minutes or less. I reintroduced it and I separated mine. Well, that wasn't working. I was starting to feel deprived, left out. So Joe and I put our heads together. I should mention that we met only 5 years ago. And collectively, we came together and said, well, here's what I found, here's what she's found, and we picked the best of each. And we're continuing to do that because the market for gluten-free products is changing every day for the better as the demand rises. One of the first steps I think that's really important is to have the context of gluten intolerance. What does it mean? Well, if you're celiac, it means that you have a genetic autoimmune that can damage the small intestine. When you ingest gluten, your immune system views it as an invader and attacks the lining of your small intestine, which prevents the absorption of nutrients and can also lead to other diseases. As of today, it's been estimated that about 1% of the US population, and even more than that worldwide, have been diagnosed with celiac. Now, if we do the math, that's over 3 million people in the US. That's not insignificant. And then if you add the category of non-celiac gluten sensitivity, which is where my diagnosis lives, that number rises even further because it's been estimated that it's 6% of the population. So you might want to ask yourself, what is going on? Why are we having all of these food sensitivities increase, exponentially? The only treatment is to eliminate gluten, 100% gluten-free diet. That's as of today. There are organizations that are working to find a cure, but as of today, we really must rely on gluten-free entirely. What makes this difficult to diagnose is that the symptoms really run the gamut, from the obvious of digestive to joint pain to tingling, even to depression and anxiety. So you can imagine how difficult that is when you show up for an appointment with your healthcare provider. It's not the first thing that they think of. So there's a push now not just to educate the patient and the individual, but to also educate the medical community. I think it's interesting to note that about a year ago, Italy, being the first in the world actually, instituted a policy where they now regularly screen for type 1 diabetes and celiac in all children ages 1 to 17. So that regardless of whether you're showing symptoms or not, Italy actually is the gold standard, and it's a little bit counterintuitive. So you wouldn't think a country with a cuisine so heavily based on wheat would be a leader. But they're also culturally very, very important to have meals together. And God forbid that you can't sit at the family table. So what exactly is gluten? It's a protein that's found in grains, and it is the protein that provides the dietary glue. So when you take that out of a pasta or a bread, you have to find something to replace it with. It's a binder. Here's a list of gluten that you might not know of, but I think it was important to recognize that the three that are the very recognizable types are wheat, barley, and rye, but there are many others. And these are examples. These are wheat variations, and some of them I even hadn't heard of. Triticale, never heard of it. Why it's important to know this is when you look at labels for ingredients, if you see any of these, it's a no. You need to stay away. What's interesting here is that gluten hides where you would least imagine it would be: condiments, processed foods, candies. I think the one that really surprised me was personal care products. So if you're someone who has an extreme sensitivity, whether you're celiac or gluten, non-celiac, gluten intolerant, you may have to avoid a shampoo that has gluten in it. And you would ask, why would a shampoo have gluten in it? It's used as a binder, it's used as a thickener. In fact, you'll find it in some chicken broths as well, for the same reason. So it's important to read labels, really important. The FDA, about 10 years ago, put out a set of regulations and criteria that manufacturers could voluntarily use to put the GF label on their products. So that makes grocery shopping a whole lot easier. Looking for that GF label, I do that even today. For example, ingredients to avoid: modified food starch, brewer's yeast, malt. I wouldn't think of wheat when I think of any of those, but those are wheat-based products that you would have to avoid. Now, if you're just working solely off the gluten-free label, you don't have to worry about it. But a lot of products don't have the gluten-free label on them. And when that's the case, it's essential to really do your homework and read labels. I mentioned chicken broth, soy sauce, condiments. Again, it's used as a thickener. So you've received the diagnosis, you've educated yourself, now what do? Well, if you're celiac, the first thing, and actually if you have an extreme intolerance as a non-celiac, you really have to thoroughly clean your kitchen. And the purpose of that is to eliminate cross-contamination. Just the smallest bit of gluten can really prompt a response. Some people have actually identified a small part of their kitchen that's their gluten-free zone, so to speak. Others have chosen to just convert the whole kitchen. In our household, since I'm not celiac, I do have some sensitivity, but I have a little leeway. I've dedicated a couple of shelves in our pantry that house all of the gluten-free products. You may need to do this if you're a non-celiac as well. Again, it depends on your sensitivity. Once you've set up your kitchen, you also, by the way, I didn't mention this, is if you are celiac, you may need to have a separate toaster oven, all kinds of kitchen utensils, again, to eliminate contamination. So now you're ready to go shopping. It's important to just familiarize yourself. What's in our local markets? Well, here we have Roach Brothers, we have Whole Foods, Mom's Market now is just opened on Route 9 in Natick. So what I suggest you do is you go to the market and take a look at the gluten-free aisle. But keep in mind that not everything's in that aisle. You'll find a lot in the freezer section, and then certain things are mixed in with regular gluten versions, like breadcrumbs, for example. Sometimes they're in the gluten-free aisle, sometimes they're in the regular aisle. So once you're familiar with where things are, it'll cut down the time. The market leaders for gluten-free flours in particular are King Arthur, which we all recognize. They've been around for a long time. They have very good gluten-free products, from a one-to-one replacement called Measure for Measure to a gluten-free all-purpose flour to many others. The difference between Measure for Measure and the all-purpose flour is that Measure for Measure includes a binder, something that replaces the gluten, and that might be xanthan gum, and the gluten-free all-purpose doesn't have the binder. So I would use that when, say, I'm making a chicken piccata, and all I need to do is dredge the chicken in flour, and I don't really need the binder. The binder sometimes can have a gummy texture, so you want to avoid that. And lastly, start with the basics. Start slow. I did not do this. I went full bore, bought all the different flours. I was going to mix them all myself, and guess what? I sat there and visited them once a day and did nothing with them. So I ended up realizing after the investment, because these products are not inexpensive, they're actually quite expensive, and for the pastas, for example, they don't come in 16-ounce quantities. They come in 8-ounce or 12-ounce. Occasionally, you'll see one that's 17, and the only reason for that is that it's a conversion from grams. So it was really essential to kind of get back to basics and just stock my pantry with what am I going to use. Let me just put a few flours in there, a few different pastas, and work from there. And as you gain more confidence and have more time, then you can branch out. Your pantry is your ally. I think this is true of just general cooking. Same thing with meal planning. If you can just put maybe 3 meals together for the week and know that you have the ingredients, it really facilitates meal prep. Even more so with gluten-free. Here's a list of items that I would suggest are in the pantry. They're in my pantry. All kinds of rice, naturally gluten-free. Oats, just be sure that they are processed in a gluten-free facility. Beans, nuts, gluten-free pastas, breads, breadcrumbs. We talked a little bit about the one-to-one flour replacements and an all-purpose gluten-free. Oils, vinegars, broths, onions, and of course, garlic, and a lot of it. Here are some of the common ingredients you'll see in a lot of products. Rice flour, corn flour. I'm starting to see some quinoa flour, lentil. We're starting to now see the introduction of legumes, lentils, all kinds of beans showing up. And the reason for that is when you eliminate gluten, you eliminate fiber. So you want to replace it. You've also eliminated some protein. So by bringing these things back in, it's a higher nutritional profile. I've just started using a lentil pasta, and they run the gamut. You can't just say all lentil pastas are created equally. They're not. So one may be very gummy, another one may be just perfect. It requires a lot of taste testing. The binders that replace gluten there's three main characters: xanthan gum, guar gum, and psyllium husk. All of these are plant-based, and they're used for different things. Xanthan gum is used in non-yeasted breads, cakes, muffins, cookies. Guar gum is a thickener you might find in ice cream. Again, an unusual place to find gluten, which is a really good reason to always read labels. And the last one, psyllium husk, again, plant-based, and that is used for yeasted breads. It helps to trap the air and increase the rise on yeasted breads. Here's a couple of natural binders: flax seeds, chia seeds, gelatins. You saw that today in the panna cotta. There's gelatin in the panna cotta, which keeps it together. Eggs, bananas, and applesauce. I've just started experimenting with these in making a gluten-free blueberry muffin that I think it's taken me the better part of 2 years. And every time I make it, I'm like, I just have to tweak it a little more. Here's a list of naturally gluten-free flours. We talk a lot about gluten-free substitutes, but there's a whole list of naturally gluten-free flours that are actually worth experimenting with. Almond flour, you're going to see a lot in baked goods. Potato flour, chickpea flour, or garbanzo bean flour is a real great one to experiment with. It's healthy, there's protein, there's fiber, and you can do lots of things with it. You can make what is called a farinata in northern Italy. This is all over the Mediterranean, and basically it's a chickpea crepe. It's 3 ingredients: chickpea flour, water, and a little olive oil. Almost like a pancake batter. And then you put it on a preheated pan, you bake it, and I've topped it with anything. I use it as a pizza substitute. It's very thin and crunchy. I've also torn it up and used it as a cracker. It's not that common here, but it's definitely something worth experimenting with. I mentioned oats before. Oat flour is another good one. Sorghum, millet, buckwheat. You might think buckwheat is not gluten-free, but it is, in fact, gluten-free. And the muffins that I've made now include oat flour, sorghum flour, and buckwheat. Quinoa flour, and we talked about corn, rice, and tapioca. Bob's Red Mill has a very long line of these products. I mentioned the market leaders, and I forgot to mention Bob's Red Mill. They have quite a few flours. They are leaders in the market, and their products are excellent. Char is another one. Char was one of the first. It's an Italian company with a US subsidiary, and they have a lot of products as well. So let's turn to the gluten-free pasta for a minute. Almost all gluten-free pastas have some combination of rice and corn flour. As I said just now, they're starting to add things like quinoa flour, yellow lentil flour, just to increase the protein and the nutritional value. There are many shapes and textures. The problem is that they're not accessible here. So in our hunt to find best in class, we went to local Italian stores, and we did have some luck. There's one in Newton, Marchettano, that has a great selection, and a pasta brand that's now become one of my favorites called Granoro, that has rice, corn, and quinoa. Why I like it is that the taste is indistinguishable, but even more important than that, the texture is indistinguishable. And that's the real catch here with gluten-free. It can be very mushy. I've been known to say to Mitch, I could hang wallpaper with this stuff. It's just awful. But the other place to go is online. So we felt so strongly about this that we dedicated a chapter in the book just on the gluten-free pantry. And in that, we've got a whole list of our favorite brands, where to get them, and the shapes and textures. As you might know, with pasta sauces, the texture matters. Depending on the sauce you're using, it won't stick to the pasta. What we realized after this research is that most of the best-in-class products are imported from Italy. Big surprise. But you can get them. You can get them online. I was astounded in our trip a couple of years ago when I went into a local grocery store to see pasta shapes I had never seen gluten-free. So we stocked our luggage with that and came home with, a whole supply. And this is exactly what I'm talking about. So here you can see some of the brands are things we don't normally see. Farabella, Veneziana is one you will see in grocery stores. Jovial is one that's now appearing a lot at Roche Brothers and at Whole Foods. And occasionally you'll see one called Rumo, which has a great gluten-free version of pasta. But as you can see here, there are many different shapes, and we've listed out various different sites. And even since the publication of this book, we've added to it. We have a list of pastas that we like that even, should have been added, but unfortunately, was post-publication. So when you think, well, it's not really that big a deal to eliminate gluten. Well, why it's a big deal is that it's such a part of cultures, not just the Italian culture, but many cultures. Bread is the staff of life. And it's the way we come together, the cultural importance of the family table. It builds community. And I can tell you that in my household, it's a way for us all to connect, and it's a proxy for love. Food is love. It's not just sustenance. Here's a couple of highlights from the book. You had the panna cotta today. You had the lemon ricotta cake. And up above are caramelized tomatoes. This is a great recipe. It's easy. It takes a couple of hours, but you don't have to do anything. You just leave it in the oven. And it's a great use of tomatoes in the middle of winter when they don't have any taste. By putting them in the oven for an hour and a half or so, it deepens the flavor and brings out the sugars. And this can be used on pizzas. It can be used as an appetizer. You can put it on pasta. I make these probably 2-3 times a month. We have a baked clam recipe that my partner Joe developed from a taste memory. This is a dish next to it that is famous in my family. It's linguine with cauliflower and onions. Kind of an unusual combination, you wouldn't think, but it's delicious because the onions are caramelized. This, oddly enough, my kids will ask for this, even on birthday celebrations. And last is chicken saltimbocca, which is something that you'll find, it's a typical Italian dish. This is a little bit different in that my mother updated it and took the veal out and put the chicken in. And we took it a step further and made it gluten-free. In this case, simply by using gluten-free breadcrumbs. But like pastas, not all gluten-free breadcrumbs are created equally. So you have to do your homework on that. So I'm busy in the kitchen a lot. And here's what I've been experimenting with. One of my favorites is gnocchi. In the book, we have a recipe for a butternut squash gnocchi, which is excellent. But I went back to basics, and I thought, let me just try the regular potato gnocchi. And that's what that is in the far left. And then I took it a step further and tried it with roasted beets. So that's my first attempt. That needs to be fine-tuned a little. And the picture next to it is a cauliflower pizza crust that was taken out of Marian Esposito's most recent cookbook. And I'm using just very simple toppings on that. And this is one that I discovered on social media, believe it or not. It's very handy to have two 20-somethings, because without them, I'm not sure I would know much about social media. Anyway, this is a recipe using zucchini, and it's very healthy. You just cube the zucchini, you cook it in a little olive oil, whole garlic cloves, add a little water, and then use an immersion blender. So you have a sauce that tastes very creamy, but there's no cream. So what you can do to reward yourself is put a nice piece of burrata cheese right in the middle. That is really delicious. Here's some more. These actually were inspired by our trip and spending time with my family. Some of the favorite dishes that I grew up with never made it, I should say, were adaptations. They were dishes made in Italy that I had never had. And one now that's become my favorite is a pureed fava bean dish used as a first course with sautéed greens. The only problem is that it's not that easy to find dried, skinned fava beans. It's possible online or in ethnic markets, Watertown and the Armenian markets, or even in the Portuguese markets in Fall River. Easy to do. Think of it as a fava bean hummus. Really delicious. This is an appetizer that I put together. It's basically rolls of prosciutto with arugula and goat cheese. And I've now even added another variation, eliminated the goat cheese and put fig jam in its place. Really tasty, really easy. This is another, what we call a pantry pasta, just simply made with olive oil and slices of garlic that are toasted in the olive oil. And what elevates this dish is toasted breadcrumbs. You wouldn't think that something as simple as that, and that's something I picked up on our trip. My mother never did that, but yet I saw her cousins doing it. Orecchiette, which is, again, a native-shaped pasta to the Puglia region with broccoli rabe. Here's my attempt at an artisan bread, gluten-free, and in this case, I've added buckwheat to increase the nutritional profile, as well as focaccia, and the dough is the same as the panzerotti. It has a potato in it. I think I made that one 3 or 4 times. It takes some trial and error with gluten-free baking. There's no two ways about it. It definitely does. This is an olive oil cake, and here are the muffins that I've been referring to. So there's been a lot of cooking going on, and there's been a lot of eating going on, right? So like most things, it takes a village. And here's mine. They are, well, Christopher's 29, Julia's 26, and you guys all know Mitch. And I'm not going to tell you how old Mitch is. But these are my taste testers. They're ready, willing, and able, and more than anything, they're honest. I always get honest feedback. So I'd like to leave you with some helpful resources. We have Marge Rogers here today, who is one of the founders of the National Celiac Association. This is an invaluable resource. There's wonderful information there. There's all kinds of publications. It is something you really need to have in your toolbox. Really, thank you, Marge. Marge got in touch with me after she heard about the book, and I joined right away. Celiac.org, another nonprofit that has some resources. Beyond Celiac is the organization I referred to that is working towards a cure. The others are, the following two are very helpful in identifying restaurants that have gluten-free options whenever you're traveling, whether locally or abroad. And the last one is ours, the Gluten-Free Epicureans. We have quite a bit of information on our website, and feel free to go and take a look. There's recipes there, as well as some general information just about gluten intolerance. So we've been busy, and October's a busy month. We have another presentation at a bookstore in the North End on the Thursday, October 24th, and 2 days later, we are at a gluten-free expo. And this is where the book is locally. Outside of the Boston area, by the way, we are also in Manhattan now at a cookbook bookstore, as well as in Federal Hill, in Providence, and in an Italian store in Portland, Maine. So really spreading our reach because we want to spread the word that there is hope, this is doable, if you have reliable recipes, and more than that, good ingredients. It's a great combination. And there we are. So I'm happy to answer any questions. Yes. Thank you. Yeah. Great question. It's up to the manufacturer. So to make this even more difficult, it's wherever they choose to put it. So it's not always that obvious. You really have to examine. It's not near where the ingredients? Not always. A lot of times it's on the front because it's used in some cases as a marketing tool. As I mentioned earlier, the gluten-free products are more expensive. Italy has recognized that. And when someone is diagnosed with celiac, they're eligible for a stipend monthly of up to 140 euros. Our country has not caught up with that yet, but it does take a bite out of your budget. So it's not a bad thing, too, just to rely on naturally gluten-free so that you're not always feeling compelled to buy gluten-free equivalents.
Does your book give product names and where to find those products?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And by the way, please feel free to reach out to me with any questions. If you're looking to find something and you can't, by all means, just call or email.
So I'm wheat-free. I don't have celiac, but my daughters have decided that they can give me pasta from Italy because it's made with the original grain, is what they say. And I wonder what you have seen, whether you've
Yeah.
seen any of that.
I had an easier time when we went to Italy. And because mine is not celiac, I have some flexibility, and I saved that for when I was visiting family. But I have heard people say this, that when they travel abroad, they don't have a problem. I will say that if you're celiac, that's not the case. So, right. And it's not just that they have different wheat. You may have had ancient grains, but aside from that, the grains are the same. The big difference is how we process and the pesticides. There are pesticides that we're still using here that are illegal in Italy. And the environmental causes are really a contributing factor to the increase in all of these cases.
And I didn't have any of the issues that are listed out in the
Symptoms.
symptoms, but I had eczema for 60 years.
And it went away.
And it went away.
Yeah.
95% of it went away.
Yeah, isn't that something?
Yeah, it was unbelievable.
And don't you wish you had known that a long time ago?
You think so?
Yeah. Any other questions? Yes.
You mentioned thyroid disease. Are people with thyroid disease more likely to have the gluten
I think it depends on the type of thyroid disease. Not all thyroid disease is autoimmune. Mine happened to be, and gluten can be inflammatory. So when you have an existing autoimmune, it exacerbates it. Yeah. Thank you all for your attention. I've recruited the church treasurer, who's in the back, if anyone would like a book. Okay, great. Thank you.
Cindy, thank you so much. We have a small gift for you.
Oh, thank you very
Thanks
much.
for coming and providing this wonderful program and also the recipes for our lovely lunch.
Oh, great. You're welcome. Absolutely. Let me just get this.